This is Jen. Charlie is not joining me for this particular teaching. Today was the first full day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that follows the Passover. And I had noticed online that there have been a lot of questions about, well, what is leaven? Because the Bible commands us to get the leaven out of our house. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in what the scripture says, but it sounds very simple. What is leaven? Let's get the leaven out. And yet I've noticed that particularly today there's been a lot of questions about what does that mean, and I'm hoping through this teaching not necessarily to tell you what you should or shouldn't get out of your house or should or shouldn't be eating, but what I'm hoping to get out of this teaching is the opportunity to kind of explain some terms, explain what leaven is from a definitional perspective, and then ultimately perhaps give you enough information to decide what leaven is that you should get out of your house. So I entitled this lesson several years ago, Get the Leaven Out, and it's a discussion of the practical question of what is leaven. And again, what I said, not to decide what I think you should get out of your house. There's going to be some terms that we're going to talk about today. Chametz, which can mean leaven. All these, by the way, can mean leaven. Seor, and of course matzah. And most of us are familiar with matzah as the unleavened bread that we typically eat at Passover. So let's talk about some definitions. The first definition is leaven. And it's defined in the English dictionary as a substance, typically yeast, that is added to dough to make it ferment and rise. And the word ferment there is going to come back and be very important. Dough that is reserved from an earlier batch in order to start a later one fermenting. A pervasive influence that modifies something or transforms it for the better. They acted as an intellectual leaven. Obviously, that's not one of the definitions that we're going to be concerned with in this teaching. And leaven can also be a verb, to cause dough or bread to ferment, to rise. Leavened breads are forbidden during Passover is an example of that. And so those are what we're talking about. We're talking about leavening agents. Chametz, if I can get the cough in there. Leavened bread, that which is leavened. That comes from Strong's 2557 if anybody wants to look that up. And then there's chometz, which is the same, kind of the same set root, and it's to be sour, leaven, be red, or be ruthless. So it kind of has some different names, but again, leavening. And there are actually 5 types of grains that can be chametz: wheat, spelt, barley, oats, and rye can be chametz. Other types of grain will not ferment, will not have that process. So, and what we're going to talk about is leavening versus fermentation. And again, like I said, this is going to come back and be important as to me as a distinction. So from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, the term leaven could be sour, leavened. Derivatives, that which is leaven: vinegar, seasoned, anything leavened. This root designates the action and result of yeast, or bread dough, which is lechem, chametz. The basic meaning is to become fermented or sour. Because what actually happens when you put yeast in is you're actually fermenting. There's actually a fermentation type process going on. So I told you the definition of seor could be leaven, and we talked about matzah. So let's talk about the scriptures and think about these definitions that we've talked about. So the scripture says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your house. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. And that's Exodus 12:15. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses. For whoever eats the leavened, that is leaven, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether an alien or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened in your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread, and that's of course the word matzah, and that's Exodus 12:19-20. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped with cloths upon their shoulders, and they baked unleavened cakes, matzah, of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt. For it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provision, food for the journey, for themselves. Exodus 12:34-39. You'll notice that the condition of the dough would be that it did not get to rest. Also, no seor, or leaven, would be added to it. So, in the very first Passover, they're basically making the dough, and they're wrapping it up and taking it with them. They're not even baking it. And the kneading bowls are wrapped, which to me means that the dough's still in there because that way it stays moist. And so they're not having time for it to rest. They're not having time, and they're taking it with them. Unleavened, and then they baked. It says the unleavened cakes of the dough as they were taken out of Egypt. So they're rushing. They're getting this. They're quickly baking it, and they're going. And that's consistent with the story we've always heard. They didn't have time for it to rise, because anyone who's cooked with particularly yeast leaven knows that it typically takes several hours for your bread to rise. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout the 7 days, and nothing leavened shall be seen among you, nor shall any leaven be seen among you in your borders. Exodus 13:7. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. Unto Jehovah 7 days you shall eat unleavened breads. Leviticus 23:6. And I can go on. It's clear. We have 7 days we're to eat unleavened bread. So let's go back to the question. What does that mean? Basically, there are 3 types of leavening. There's biological, chemical, and mechanical. There is leaven even in the air. What leavens your grains to make breads and cakes? You can have sourdough, yeast, baking powder, baking soda, and other leavening agents that we're going to talk about. So, first of all, let me say that I have never seen any interpretation as to leaven that you're supposed to get out of your house as it relates to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that yeast is not a leavening agent that you must get out, or any products that contain yeast. So I've never seen any argument about that. I think clearly they had yeast in biblical times, that yeast is the primary leavening agent that you must get out of your house, or anything containing it. Leavening agents in the modern definition, a leavening agent, also leavening or leaven, is any one of a number of substances used in doughs and batters that cause a foaming action which lightens and softens the finished product. The leavening agent, biological, chemical, or even mechanical, reacts with moisture, heat, acidity, or other triggers to produce gas, usually carbon dioxide and sometimes ethanol, that becomes trapped as bubbles within the dough. Yeast is an example of a biological leavening agent. And of course, there's sourdough starters. In sourdough bread, the flavor is further enhanced by various lactic acid, bacteria, and so forth. But again, those of you who've done a sourdough starter, the sourdough starter is a leavening agent, and I've noticed that many people are getting their sourdough starters out of the house. And so we start out with yeast, is a biological agent. Leavening with yeast is the process based upon fermentation. Again, we're going to go back to this fermentation concept, biologically changing the chemistry of the dough or batter as the yeast works. Remember, fermented and sour is part of the definition of chametz. Yeast can also be used to make alcoholic beverages like beer or wine. It is believed that yeast-risen bread was first developed in Egypt. Interestingly enough, the Egyptians were accomplished brewers, and so they had yeast on hand. They also invented the first bread ovens, and air is filled to build air is full of it is also full of yeast cells. So it's interesting to me that we have the Hebrew children. When do we first hear about unleavened bread? What are we remembering? Of course, it's leaving Egypt. And where does leavened bread start? It's in Egypt. And so, God's telling them, they've learned how to use the yeast to raise the bread. And God's telling them, you didn't have time, and to remember that we don't eat leaven. Other biological agents can be beer, unpasteurized live yeast, buttermilk if it's used in bread, ginger beer, kefir, yogurt, sourdough starter, and yeast. All these are biological leavening agents. Now, the question becomes, are they the leaven we're supposed to get out of our house? Because that's a pretty long list, including yogurts and dairy products. So then we have chemical leavening agents. And chemical leaveners are chemical mixtures or compounds that typically release carbon dioxide or other gases when they react with moisture or heat. Chemical leaveners are used in quick breads, cakes, and well as cookies and numerous other applications where a long biological fermentation is inappropriate or undesirable. These are generally referred to as baking powders. And that can be baking powder, baking soda. There's a whole list of these types of leavening agents. Now, what's interesting with the chemical leavening agents is these did not exist in biblical times, and these do not process by a fermentation process. So, does that change them being leavened? There are different opinions, therefore, about chemical leavening agents because they did not exist in biblical times. There are some people that say you don't have to include those because since when God said to eat unleavened bread and to keep the chametz and the leaven out, clearly he wasn't talking about chemical agents like baking powders because they didn't exist. These were obvious, I'll say it this way. If I was in ancient Egypt, we wouldn't even have a discussion about these products because they didn't exist. On the other hand, they are a leavening agent and they are done to produce that leavening action. Then we have mechanical leavening agents. Creaming is the process of beating sugar crystals and solid fats like butter together in a mixture. This integrates tiny air bubbles in the mixture since the sugar and the crystals physically cut through the structure of the fat. Cream mixtures are usually further leavened by chemical leavener, which is often used in cookies. Using a whisk on certain liquids, notably cream or egg whites, can also create foams through mechanical action. This is the method employed in making sponge cakes, angel food cakes, where egg protein matrix produced by vigorous whipping produces almost all the structure. So some people do not want to eat angel food cake, for example, because they say, well, the egg is acting like a leavening agent, but is the egg really leaven, or is it simply that's the characteristic of the product? Because I don't think they would say you can't eat eggs, but you can't eat a cake like a angel food cake made with eggs because the egg there is acting as a leavening agent. So there's different opinions about that. And then there's other leaveners such as steam and air are used as leavening agents. Obviously we can't keep water out of our house and we really can't get air out of the house. So I think it's quite clear that these were not the leaveners that God's talking about. These are not the leavening agents, although they can be considered a leaven. So addressing the Jewish tradition, one of the things they will do, anything they feel like has leaven in it, they'll sell the leaven. They have the 18-minute rule, which is that once you mix an agent such as the spelt or the wheat with water, that you have 18 minutes to produce it before the grain starts fermenting, and that begins in 18 minutes. So you have to get everything done in 18 minutes. Fermented grain versus fermented anything else. Apple cider vinegar is from apples. So other vinegars are fermented wheat. Soy sauce includes wheat. Taman is fermented by soybeans. So they have all these other products. This is why it can get very confusing this time of year. Is, well, what am I supposed to get? Am I going to get rid of, everything? Honey, for example, is not a leavening agent, but it can assist the leavening. Beer and wine are not leavened bread, but if not pasteurized, can be leavening agents. And some beers contain grains. Autolyzed yeast or yeast extract is a flavoring. It is not a leavening agent. It is an MSG. So that may be a different reason why you don't want to eat it, but it's not leaven. So let's go back to, now that we have all this information and we basically figured out that almost anything could in some way be a leavening agent, what does the scripture say, and what does it mean we need to get out of our house? I think sourdough starters and yeast are absolutely need to be, I don't think there's any argument that anyone's ever had. Baking powder, baking soda, and other chemical leavening agents, I personally generally get baking powders out of the house. Baking soda can be used for things that aren't leaven. So although I may not eat cookies and things that have baking soda in them, I may not necessarily remove the actual baking soda from the house. And I'm not sure of any other chemical. Mechanical eggs, I don't think that that's considered leaven. I think that that's the nature of an egg, but it's not a leavening agent. It's not something I would put in the bread to make it rise, like I would yeast. Non-bread products such as vinegar and beer, typically vinegar we would keep in the house, but beer, because it has that fermenting process to it, typically we take beer out of the house. Non-food products like household cleaners that contain baking soda, the scripture says we're not to eat unleavened bread. If it's a household cleaner, I'm not eating it. I don't see any reason why you need to take it out if it's being used as a cleaner or something like that. I'm not going to eat, my household cleaner that may contain baking soda. So let's look back at time at Yah and when he gave these instructions. The kneading process could have included adding leavening agents. Since they weren't to eat leavened bread, they rushed to get out of Egypt with the bread, and the bread was unleavened. We will look at what was leavened in their day for today. The indication from Numbers 33:5 would seem to indicate more than a day's journey from Ramses. They start with the dough in the morrow after the Passover offering, as seen in verse 4. This would be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This meant that the dough, without the right conditions, introduced the leavening agent, would not rise right away. So they set out from Ramesses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. It was on the morrow of the Passover offering that the Israelites started out defiantly in plain view of the Egyptians. The Egyptians, meanwhile, were burying those among them whom Jehovah had struck down, every firstborn, whereby Jehovah executed judgment on their Elohim. The Israelites set out from Ramesses and escaped at Sukkoth. This matches the account in Exodus 12:33-39. The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. The Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing. And Jehovah had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their requests. Thus they stripped the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. Moreover, a mixed multitude went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herd. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt, could not delay, nor had they prepared any provision. So really what they describe, they take the dough and they don't bake it till they get to where they're going. So the 18-minute rule would have been really out the window if that's the case. So basically what you've got going on is that there are, and you go back to this fermenting concept. With yeast, you're fermenting, you're creating an action in it, you're putting something in your mixture to make it rise. And that's what I look at. It says you're not to eat unleavened bread. So am I putting something in the flour, in the bread dough, to make it rise? And if I'm adding a leavening agent, such as yeast, such as baking powder, then I try to get those things out of my house. If it's not something I'm adding, if it's just water and flour and olive oil, then that is not leavened. And you need to be careful of your flatbreads, because even your flatbreads like tortillas will usually have a leavening agent in them to make them lighter. Crackers generally have a leavening agent in them to make them lighter. Vinegar is not in the bread. It's not usually used as a leavening agent in the bread unless I don't remember how you make sourdough, but since it's not in bread, I don't remove it from the house. It's because it's not part, it specifically says unleavened bread. There's some other resources online that kind of go through these things. There's a very good article online called Leaven, Leavened and Unleavened Bread, Seor Chametz Matzot by Yohanan Zakantov, who's of a Karaite Jew persuasion. If you can find that, it goes into marmalade and all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, my belief is that, things that have wheat and leaven in them, such as beer, bread, and those things, where you've added a leavening agent, those are the things, in my opinion, you need to get out of your house. But some of the other things, some people say wine, for example, has leaven, but it talks about we're supposed to drink the bread and the wine. So clearly wine is not intended to be taken out of your house. So those are the things that I look at. Again, there's some other resources online and you can do your own research, but I don't take dairy products out. There's some people who hold that, the dairy could have some leaven in it. It's not bread, so therefore the dairy doesn't go out of the house. Some sects believe you shouldn't have pastas or beans or lentils, anything that would get larger, because that's like leaven. But that's not a leavening agent. Pasta typically does not contain leaven, and beans is a vegetable. So again, this is not, we're to take the leaven out of our house. We're not to eat unleavened bread. And so the leavening is focusing on the bread, not on the fact that, when you make it, it gets bigger. That's really not what the scripture talks about at all. And if you have any other questions, you can comment, private message me. But I think that's the summation of what is leaven.